Is this working? Right, I think we're ready to go. Hello, everyone. Hello. You're very welcome to the Library Mistakes. You'll get Russell in a second, so don't worry. I just wanted to make welcome to the start of our autumn-winter season, which is going to be very exciting. This is a particularly exciting set of events for us because this is part of the wider Edinburgh Finance Festival taking place at the moment. And can I just say, we're by far and away the best part. And you'll see there's another 4 events after this, so please come along to those. There's still some tickets, I think, for all of them, and you'd be welcome at all of them. It's also something I have put is this event is being supported by the Irish Consulate in Edinburgh, so we're delighted to have their support for tonight's event and for tomorrow night's event taking place at the University of Edinburgh. And the only other thing I want to say is you'll see the QR codes, I think, around the building. If you, at the back there, I think there's one at the door. Thank you for supporting us. If you feel you can support us any further, please just point your camera at that and it will give you the option to support us. I'm now going to hand over to Russell.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back. Summer's over. Welcome back to the Library of Mistakes. There's a few new faces tonight, all with very distinctive accents. Welcome. Let me tell you about the library, just in case you haven't been before. We are a free public library. You can sign up, register. We're open 9 to 5. Monday to Saturday. When you register, you can come to the library by making an appointment. You also get invited to all these lectures, and all of our content is recorded and free online. So that's my advert for the library. Welcome back to our regular readers. But I'm really here to introduce Patrick tonight. Patrick has a long career as a public advisor in economics, because he was involved originally with Gareth Fitzgerald's government as an economic advisor in the 1980s. He has degrees from UCD in economics, but also the LSE, been involved with the IMF, involved far from these shores. But probably now, most famously, and what he's about to talk about, is his stint as the Governor of the Central Bank of Ireland from September 2009. I think it's important I mention the date, from September 2009 to 2016. Patrick was the Governor of the Central Bank of Ireland. So tonight he's going to talk us through that. An incident which is burned in, even if you're not Irish, I think is burned in your memory for what went on in that period and obviously after that period as well. So I know, Patrick, you've delivered this twice before, but I think the audience tonight's particularly receptive. So please, you do that. You and I will have a conversation, and then we'll go to Q&A from the audience. Patrick, over to you. Just one press. Just one press.
Is it? Yeah.
Yep.
Got it. Okay, well, thank you very much for coming. I feel, to some extent, it's cold to Newcastle to be talking about the great financial crisis in the banking dimension to Edinburgh, your own experience. So you might think you know all about this, and it's just going to be a repetition of what happened to the Scottish banks. But I think the Irish story has a lot of idiosyncrasies, a lot of differences, and mistakes that were made or may not have been made. And that's really what I want to do tonight, is talk a little bit about what happened, and then talk about a number of the mistakes that were made and a number of the mistakes that, well, maybe they weren't mistakes. And that might lead into the discussion. The way I want to frame this, Robert Shiller, Nobel Prize winner in economics, wrote about financial crises back in the 1990s. And he said, his way of thinking about this was, the reason we get these boom and bust cycles is that the booms are very plausible to the people who are taking decisions in banks, property developers, business generally, the government. They're plausible because a narrative takes hold. People say, you know, we've seen people lose money on ventures before, but this time it's different, and it's different because, and there's a sort of a half-truth develops. There are some elements of it which are plausible, but these elements are not sufficient to support the boom going on forever. They drive speculation to an extent which is going to topple over. Now, these narratives, they reflect the evolving perception, or really misperception, of what's happening in the economy and in society. But they also affect the progress of the crisis. Now, Shiller's concern was, let's not have crises. It would be better to try and deal with this narrative dynamic in the build-up to the crisis. But I think it's also informative to think about the narratives that develop after the crisis has broken. And so let me see. I have to move these slides on a bit. Let me just remind you that this was a big boom and bust. Normally, you would see, for different crises around the world, you'd see development of GDP. You will never see me show you a chart of GDP. I'll say a little bit more about why later on. The numbers are so distorted by the way that the activities of the American multinationals are accounted for in GDP. So GDP is about 75% at the moment higher than a realistic comparative number would be. And it varies a lot over time. This is just employment. It doesn't capture everything, but it captures the scale of the boom, which went very steadily right up there until 2007, and then the scale of the crash. So going down from nearly 2,200,000 down to 1.85 million in terms of employment. I'll show you later at the very end where it is now. But this is this was a big bust, and that's the point, middle of 2012, when the turning point really in terms of economic activity. From then there was a recovery. Okay, so there's Shiller. So we have 4 Shillerian narratives to frame the discussion today. The first narrative is, this was a mistake that the Minister for Finance made. He said, come on, we all partied. It didn't go down well. Not a very wise political statement to make. A lot of people said, you may have partied, but we did not party. There was some truth in it, of course. A lot of the decision makers and powerful people, influential people, did party, did very well. And I remember a nice article by Gillian Tett in the Financial Times after the bust, and she said, I visited Ireland, I talked to a lot of people, and she said it's like visiting somebody after a very hard night out, and they're groaning on the sofa. They're not able to get up because they know there has been excess and that they are now suffering the consequences. So there's an element of that. But as time went on, a number of different perceptions became dominant. So we all partied. I'll say a little bit about the partying. The next perception was that really focused in September 2008. This has nothing to do with Ireland. There's a global financial crisis, and it's affecting us in the same way as we might say, well, the attack of Russia on Ukraine, it may affect us. Let's see what we need to do, but it's nothing really to do with us. Sideswipe. We're being sideswiped by Lehman Brothers. And that's something that influenced the decisions that were taken very crucially around September 2008. Now, the next narrative I will talk about relates to the period after the things had calmed down globally, and it became evident that the Irish banking collapse and the Irish economic collapse was much more severe than in most other countries, not all, but most other countries. And this phrase was used. It's very bad, but it's manageable. I'm afraid I have some responsibility for this phrase. This didn't go down well either, but then I'm not a politician, so it didn't matter. But it was very bad, and it was managed, but it wasn't really a good thing to say. But I'll talk a little bit about the period of management. And then, as people started to recover, oh, I'm supposed to stand, I see. I was told to stand in front of the steps, and then I realized I can't stand in front of the steps. So I better stand closer to where a camera is. Is that what you're trying to tell me, David?
No, I'm trying to tell those gentlemen.
Oh, yeah, okay. All right. Well, can I move from side to side in an irritating way? No?
No, we love that.
All right. So the fourth narrative is when people start to get their mojo back, they start to say, wait a minute, we're not all to blame for this. And they start, well, it's the ECB is to blame. The foreigners are to blame. Fortunately, that didn't really build into a xenophobia, but there was a discussion around that, and that's still probably, we're still in the residue of that, and they'd probably say, well, we would have done a lot better if it hadn't been for. And so there's some truth in that, and maybe not as much truth as some people would say. So that's the way I'm going to go through it. So there we are, and that's the first one. So the first period is this reckless, uncontrolled lending by banks. It wasn't unique to Ireland, and it was happening in a context where most of the financial systems of the advanced economies were really in a very, very bullish environment. From late 1990s, there was lashings of liquidity all over the world for reasons which you don't need to go into, but China globalizing and East Asian countries trying to build up savings. So there was a lot of money to be had around. And it wasn't just Irish banks in Ireland that did the borrowing in order to finance lending to property developers and homeowners. Here's a chart that I like. This one just shows the 6 banks, the 6 nationally controlled banks in Ireland, and the way they grew. And I want to show you a few things about it, but I think you'll see, one thing I'll point out to you, if there's no pointer on this. Anyway, I read something that you're not meant to use these pointers. See this little red one here? Not so big, and then suddenly it becomes the 3rd largest bank. And that's Anglo-Irish Bank. And I'll let you in on a secret. In discussions, government officials after the crash, each of these banks got a nickname so that you could, or we just had a word about I won't say AIB, but so that each of the banks had a nickname, and the nickname for Anglo-Irish Bank was Red. So I said, have you been talking to Red? Says, if we have time, I'll tell you the other nicknames if I can remember them. But there were other banks that were active in the market as well. There were 2 Scottish banks, if we can call them that. RBS subsidiary, which was Ulster Bank, no longer active south of the border. Bank of Scotland, Ireland, no longer exists at all. A branch of Danske Bank, Danish Bank, and Belgian Bank, KBC. So these were quite substantial. There were a couple of others. These are substantial players as well. And what result did their activities have? Well, of course, they put a lot of money into the market, and the house prices went up. I ran the house prices. This is the real house prices in Dublin, deflated by the Consumer Price Index. So it goes up quite a lot, actually. It starts to see in 1995, that's somewhere in the middle, is 100, and you see it's 400 and something at the peak. So it's gone up by 300% in 11 years. And that's higher than anybody else. I mean, if you choose shorter periods, you can find other countries going faster, but that big increase. I put the chart back because I want to tell you where we bought our house, which we still live in. There. So that's a 13% per annum growth over a 10-year period, real. Okay. And this is the period that really did the damage, this period here. There's a little slump here in 2001.
Stand down and use a pointer. I'm worried about you hopping up and down.
Thank you. It was very good of you. Very good of you, yeah. And a lovely umbrella. This is the period that did the main amount of damage. And it's not just prices. I think if you look at the British experience, it was mainly prices going up in that period. It's actually activity as well. Now, the banks were lending to property developers, Irish property developers who couldn't find anything else to build in Ireland. They were buying stuff in Romania and New York and Chicago, London, and so on. But there was a lot of activity. You see the rate of housing completions starting again in the mid-1990s, but really, really, really growing and growing and growing. So the higher the prices, the more houses they were building. Now, we know that if you build more houses, the prices should go down, but not in the bubble. So there was a price and construction bubble. The boom was extensive. It was a boom, therefore, in employment. We saw the employment figures because you had to build, even to build houses. Immigration, to get people working and building to build the houses. The fiscal surplus, because more activity. These taxes of various sorts. So the boom was very, very broad-based. Banks, where were the banks getting the money? I indicated already, they're getting it from abroad. Bank borrowing was actually quite substantial before if we go back to, say, 2002, it was only 19% of GNP. GNP is a little bit safer than GDP to look at. And it had got to 64% 4 years later. So almost something equivalent to half of a year's GNP used foreign borrowing. How did they get the money? Well, as I said, there was plenty of money in the international system. So it was very easy for the Irish banks to borrow money. Say, we want to issue a new bond. Well, we prefer to have a deposit. A deposit. And how much the interest rates were very keen. And if somebody said, well, could you not do any better for us now here? Because we're prepared to invest in Irish banks, but this is a very low return. Well, we could give you another 0.25%. But what's the but? It'll be a subordinated debt. Oh, it's okay, I'll take that. So the banks were issuing, that's Anglo's last subordinated debt issue, which I think was, by memory, 2005. So you're right into it. They paid 25 basis points over what was being paid for primary debt. So very easy for the banks to get money. Of course, they also had to get customers. If they were going to lend to the property developers build houses, somebody has to buy the houses. So the banks are keen to lend to the people who are going to buy houses as well. And then bankers would tell you that, I'm not worried about lending to property developers because we lend to the people who are going to buy the houses, so everything is going to be all right. But some people don't have good deposit to buy a house. So the bank said, well, you don't really need to have too much of a deposit. Here's a sort of complicated chart. I think just let's look at the dotted lines. These are the proportion of bank lending in which there was no deposit required, at least 100% loan. Sometimes they gave 105% loan because, you buy furniture and stuff. I mean, come on. So, and for first-time buyers, of course, they were more liberal. So you can see the process as the house prices got higher and higher, and it must have started to seem to people that maybe this is not very secure. They actually are making a higher proportion of their loans that's the 91 to 95%. So these people did have to put up some money. This grey one is the 100% plus, and you see more and more and more of these loans are being given at 100% plus. So, okay, and with that, they were growing and growing. Anglo-Irish Bank, I keep on coming back to it because it's by far the worst managed bank. Its average growth rate of its assets in real terms was 36% per annum for 10 years. It was growing at that rate. And the wonderful stock markets, did they think, well, Anglo-Irish Bank growing very rapidly, maybe we shouldn't pay too much for their shares? No, the equity value was quintupled in a period in which the two biggest banks, AIB and Bank of Ireland, only doubled. So there's competition among banks then. The two old banks are thinking, oh, we're losing market share. We're not going to be the biggest bank anymore. And of course, they do lend collateralized. You lend to property developer, say, well, we need to have some collateral. But the way, as the property prices are going up, bank would lend to a property developer. He'd say, I have this property, and it's worth about 100. Will you lend me? Will you lend me 80? Say, okay. And now, coming back a few years later, the property. Remember that property I had was 100. It's actually worth 250 now. So I'm wondering, could you lend me another 130, and I'll give you no new collateral? So this cross-collateralization, making them very vulnerable to a price fall. And of course, the price fall came. I'm on to my second sideswipe by layman, because I want to talk in this segment about what the government was doing about this and what they actually did about it when the crunch came. This unfortunate quotation here is from the man who was the head of financial regulation at the central bank just after the collapse of Lehman Brothers. And I'm going to get the date wrong, but it's a few days after that, after the guarantee. And he was asked to, but the banks must be in some difficulties now because the price is coming down. They can't borrow money on the international markets. And he said, by any estimate, the Irish banks are so well capitalized. And the point is that they weren't. Now, the numbers that the accountants were signing off on, in accordance with standard accounting procedures, did seem to indicate that they had adequate capital. But capital is only as good, your measure of capital is only as good as your measure of the recoverable value of the loans and the other assets that the bank has. And suddenly that was in doubt. Why did the banking supervision people at the central bank not realize that the situation was very difficult? Well, they had a long history of deferential and tentative supervision of the banks. The institution of the central bank felt that it really ought to be supervising the banks. But when you're talking about big institutions like Bank of Ireland, which had been there for over 200 years, AIB nearly as long in terms of its components and that, what could the central bank do to second guess the quality of their risk judgment and that? So it was sort of formulaic that go through some processes, but we really think that they know what they're doing. So I think that was the tone of many of the people working in bank supervision. But they worked hard and got probably distracted at implementing the new international agreement, Basel II, which is coming into force in the early years of the new millennium. Very complicated system of bank supervision requiring lots of elaborate calculations. So this is sort of process. It wasn't reality. So they didn't really have much information. Late in the day, we're talking about the end of 2007, which is after the collapse of Northern Rock and there are various other shaking events in the European and American financial markets. They thought maybe we should really look at the lending to property developers. By the biggest banks, let's take the 5 biggest banks, and for each of them, let's ask them about their 5 biggest property borrowers. It was a very interesting and useful exercise, or it should have been useful, but it wasn't used. They found things like they asked one bank, okay, you've lent a couple of billion to this property developer. How much do you think that property developer has from other banks? they underestimated by 1 billion what he probably has a couple of 100 million. No, he has 1 point what? Shocking discovery that the banks don't actually know what the exposure of the borrower is. You say, well, we're not worried because we have a personal guarantee from the main shareholder of the property developer. Banks are saying that we lend to the property developer, but we have a personal guarantee from him, and the personal guarantee is for 100 million. And does he have 100 million? Oh, he would have, yeah. But what's your evidence? Well, what he told us, he was good for 100 million. I'm not exaggerating. So this was this should have revealed to them that the banks did not actually know what they were doing, and that the central bank didn't know how bad the situation was in terms of that. So this is quite a serious deficiency. But it meant that when it came to the collapse of Lehman Brothers, and it came to the point where the Irish banks, which had already, I have a chart here, the Irish banks already in March of 2008, we all know about the stock market collapse in March the 17th. The stock markets were closed in Dublin, but they were open in other places. The Irish banks' shares fell sharply. But less evident, but known to the market participants, were if the banks, the bonds that had been issued by the banks, so should be risk-free effectively, they were trading at changing hands at very high premia. That shows 5 percentage points for Anglo-Irish Bank relative to the rest of the market. So that was in March, and things died down. Everything, people said, well, maybe it's all over now, but then zoomed up again in September. It's at this point, just a week after Lehman's, that Anglo is not able to repay the debt. It's falling due the next morning. That's the night of the guarantee. So the other banks were not. They could pay what was due the following morning, but they were very nervous about how long is this going to last if one of the banks falls over, one of the Irish banks. So that's the point at which the guarantee was decided, that the Irish government is a AAA borrower. It's very rapid growth. You saw the rapid growth. I didn't show you the fiscal accounts, very, very healthy, very low debt to GDP. Be nice to have that now. We'll just guarantee everything. Just guarantee everything. Well, not the British banks. No, we'll guarantee the Irish banks. And what do we guarantee? The deposits. Yeah, the deposits, bonds, because bonds are falling to everything. So there was a little bit of clawback. There are a few things that weren't guaranteed, and of course, the share equity was not guaranteed, but a very, very expansive guarantee. I think we'll come back at the end to what extent this was a mistake, probably a mistake. But I think I've given the context of what was happening. Let me skip that and see how we're doing for time. Yeah. Well, the next narrative is bad but manageable. So at first, the guarantee was great because the market said it's a AAA country. Banks are guaranteed, so there's no problem. So the money came back into the banks for a while, for several months actually. And other countries were not pleased with this. They said, wow, what are you doing? The British government was not happy at all because they were facing their own problems with Royal Bank of Scotland and with Lloyd's, which had just taken over Halifax Bank of Scotland. So they were not happy at all. They said, well, we'll have to give a guarantee. So even the German government said, no, you don't need to worry about your savings account at our banks. They didn't write that into legislation, but there was this, Ireland has triggered a sort of, the governments will take care of their banks, which is not happy to. And they did it because they thought it would be very damaging to the economy to have bank failures, and they did it because they felt we're a AAA country. We can easily guarantee this thing. Okay, it's 400 and something billion euros, but the only thing we'd ever be called for would be the deficit, not the whole 440 billion. At the end, you get the money back, and there might be some deficiency. And they didn't think there was a deficiency at all, but there was. The deficiency was, well, that's the story that we'll come to. So if the situation is bad, as it became again, and as the months dragged on, the financial markets became more and more sceptical about not only the situation of the Irish banks, but the ability of the Irish government to cover the guarantee and to cover the banks, because it became evident that the Irish government was not getting the sort of tax receipts that it had been getting for the previous years, because the property market is down, and the whole rest of the economy is down. And it looks as if the banks are going to be drawing on money because of this guarantee. So now I showed you the boom in property prices. I didn't show you the bust in property prices. Maybe I did. I can't remember whether I did or not. Anyway, there's the bust. Yeah, I didn't. It just went up the boom and then it fell. You might say, well, that's a very sharp fall, but it's not really a very sharp fall, because from peak to trough is almost 5 years. And that was part of the problem in this bad but manageable period. Government officials thought this is very bad, but we can manage it, because they weren't absolutely sure how far things would go down. The fall from peak to trough is 61% in Dublin. So it's a very, very steep fall, but it's spread out over 5 years. So after 2 years, you're thinking, well, it's fallen a lot, but at this price, we could probably get away with relatively small losses, but it's still falling. We don't know how far it's going to fall. Various tools were used by the government at this stage to try to stabilize the situation. The first thing was, we better put in some capital into the banks, risk-bearing capital. The government would pay for this. We put in 10 billion euros. It seemed like a big sum of money. And they put it into Bank of Ireland. They put it into AIB. They decided not to put anything into Anglo-Irish Bank because they discovered some of the management things that were going on. They said, no, we don't want to put any money. We're going to take over control of this. We'll nationalize it. Interestingly, the concept that nationalization then meant that the depositors and creditors of Anglo-Irish Bank would be safer than any other bank because it was now nationalized. There was no mechanism had been put in place to seize control of a bank in order to put it into a process of resolution which would distinguish between we'll pay these people and we won't pay those people, we need this service to go on. There was no legislation for that. So it was all or nothing, and if you nationalize it, you actually had to pay everything, or you just put it into a bankruptcy. And why are you going to bankrupt a state-owned bank? It's not going to look good. So this nationalization looked like another strong, decisive move, but not one that gives you a lot of maneuverability, because there hadn't been any preparation, no resolution law. Now, did other countries have resolution laws? Yes, most middle-income developing countries had resolution legislation for banks because they'd had failures, so they were going to do this legislation. And the British government had introduced first round of their resolution legislation earlier that year because of what happened to Northern Rock. The Irish government decided, no, because if we introduce resolution, people will think that our banks are in trouble. So they didn't have that preparation. There's a drip feed of bad news then. Oh, sorry, I forgot to tell you the other two. I told you the tools that were used. It was government insertion of capital. A new entity called NAMA was established to buy compulsory purchase of the property-related loans of the banks. What was the point of that? And the point of that was, first of all, by taking the loans off the banks, these are the loans that are really performing very poorly and are going to be the bulk of the losses of the banks. By taking it away from the banks, you stop them getting distracted on the whole business of recovering money which is dead in the water. They should be helping the economy recover, providing financial services, loans and that. You take it away. Also, you provide some certainty for the banks going back into the market and saying, look, we don't have any of those property rights. That's all those people have been fired. We don't have the loans anymore. We're a solid bank. You can lend money to us. So now the government wasn't going to buy them at face value. The government established a method, along with the European Commission, said you've got to do this properly, of pricing these loans on the basis of the falling property prices. Price these loans and only give the banks what they really are worth. And actually, that worked out well in the end. Now I made a small profit, so probably the prices were, broadly speaking, about right. So that meant there was a hole in the balance sheet of the banks, and that's where the capital was being used, and additional capital was needed, especially for Anglo-Irish Bank. But as NAMA started to announce, we've just taken the first tranche of loans. We've just got the first 10 loans of the biggest debtors, and the percentage haircut we're applying to these loans is such and such a percentage. Oh, well, that'll mean that those banks have to be recapitalized to the extent of this. And now the second tranche has come out a couple of months later. Unfortunately, the haircuts are higher, even more capital. So in the summer of 2010, there's a drip feed of bad news. So Anglo definitely well underwater. Looking now as if AIB, the largest bank, could be underwater as well. So at this stage, the markets are becoming really frightened about their ability to get the money back from the government, the money that they have lent to the government, not to the banks. They're worried about the banks too, but they're always worried about the banks. But they're afraid the government won't be able to pay its own debt because it's going to be putting money into Anglo-Irish Bank and the other banks. And then the government announces that the borrowing requirement for the third quarter is going to be such and such, which includes the recapitalization of Anglo-Irish Bank. It's a huge sum. Nobody ever saw a government deficit of that magnitude in Europe ever, percentage of GDP. So the markets are becoming really alarmed about the security of their Irish government debt. So you see there's orange is German. Interest rates are going down and down and down. This goes right up into January 2015, so that you can see the whole of the evolution of the crisis. Up until middle of 2007, Irish government debt, British government, German government debt, just give me either, it doesn't matter, I don't care which, they're both equally good. By the end of 2000, beginning of 2009, there's quite a spread has opened up, but that's the sort of spread that you'd expect. It's about 1 percentage point, a little bit more than 1 percentage point. But as 2010 proceeds, you see the gap is widening and widening, this drip feed of bad news. So it's at that point, one short-term pressure point for this was that the guarantee was a 2-year guarantee. It wasn't a guarantee forever. It was a guarantee for 2 years. Now, it didn't completely end for most of the banks, but there was a huge amount of guaranteed debt that was falling due on the end of September 2010. And this was the point at which people started to realize how much the government is paying out for these bank losses, and the rest of the government's finances are even worse shape. So that's a real trigger point. And a lot of people in the market thought, I bet they'll repudiate the guarantee. I bet they won't pay the guarantee at the end of September. So that's part of what you see in this price. People are saying there's real panic in the market for this. I suppose that's not in that particular curve, but it's in the bank's curve that I showed you a minute ago. And so we're now on the edge of the bailout, which it became evident that if the markets don't trust the markets are now at this point asking for 5 percentage points above German debt. You want to buy 10-year German debt, you get it for 2.5% yield. You get a 2.5% yield. Irish, you're going to get a 7.5% yield, and the 5 is to compensate you for the risk that you will never get your money back. And at this point, you can't continue. First of all, you're getting to the point where you're not going to be able to borrow anything from the markets. This is sort of notional, 5%. The government's not actually borrowing in the markets at this stage because it says this is too expensive. If they tried to, probably the rates would go even higher. So it's essential then to get official support from institutions like the IMF or your partners in the European Union, because otherwise you can't pay the government's salaries, you can't pay the unemployment assistance, you can't pay anything, because your borrowing requirement is quite substantial at this stage. So that's why they go into an IMF program. And I think this is where we turn the page over. Remind myself, I'm sorry, my memory isn't as good as it used to be, so I never know what's going to happen next. Okay. I won't pay any attention to this. And there's, you see, just the fall of. No, that's too much detail. That's too much detail. So, well, and that's in the wrong place for what I want to tell you now. This is just another way of looking at how things deteriorated. But in fact, the market is made up of different elements, as I'm sure all these books prove that here. This is what the credit rating agencies said about Irish government debt. It starts in January 2009. Remarkably, 3 months after the famous guarantee, Ireland is still a AAA country from all three major credit rating agencies in January 2009. They're becoming a little bit pessimistic, and by the summer of 2010, they've brought things down, but only to AA. That's AA. See, rating 1 is AAA, AA plus, 3 is AA, and so on. So you think, well, things are not so bad. We're a AA country. What's Britain now at the moment, by the way? AA, I think. And then you think, well, and not only that, but they're going to the IMF, and they're going to get lots of money from the IMF and the European funds. So that should go back up. No. No. All three rating agencies mark the Irish government debt down. It goes way down. Only one of them ever puts the Irish debt at below, into the junk bond territory. Investment grade is that blue line running along there. So Moody's thought that Irish government debt was junk. If you thought Irish government debt was not junk at that point, especially the day that they probably chose the worst day, sometime in June of 2011, you could have made an awful lot of money by buying Irish government debt in the financial markets and watching its price go up and up and up as confidence returned. It's quite interesting, really, to see. So not everybody knows everything, and these guys are paid only to know whether government debt, and in this particular instance, government debt is a good investment, is going to be repaid. But the bailout was not considered to be good for the Irish government. So why is that? Well, there are a lot of things wrong with the bailout. And the most important thing that was wrong is that the interest rate was too high. And the reason the interest rate was too high was as follows, briefly. Greece had also been in trouble earlier in the year, and people had a very low opinion of the way Greece was running its affairs, people in official circles, and they said, this is terrible, we're very poor, and we'll lend money to them, but we'll lend them, we're in cooperation with the IMF. The IMF, how much money do you think Greece needs? Well, a lot. Well, what's your interest rate on it? Well, let me see. We have a basic interest rate for lending, but we're keen to get our loans back quickly, and we're keen not to be putting out too much of our loanable funds to one country. So we have surcharges for long-term debt and surcharges for big debt. And so it ramps up. So the rate will be 5.7%. Okay, so a few months later, Ireland is in trouble, and the Irish, but we didn't expect this of the Irish, but anyway. Well, what we have to give them the same interest rate. So basically, we had the interest rate on Irish government debt in the market was 500 basis points, 5% above Germany. But what the IMF were lending was at 3 percentage points. That's a lot of money. 3% on a lot of money is a lot of money, and will you ever be able to get out of it? And it was not just the IMF that was making those loans. The Europeans said, well, we don't know how to price loans, so we're going to take the IMF. No, they lent at the same price. So financial market people said, I don't think this is going to work. I don't think they can trade out of this. And you know what the officials in the Department of Finance and the Central Bank, the top officials in the Department of Finance and the Central Bank said at the time? They said to each other, I don't think this is going to work. So why do they do it? Because they said, if it doesn't work, this is official relations. These are our partners. These are IMF, European, we're partners. They'll change the rules. And was that right? Yes, it was. They did change the rules. So 7 months later, they said, the Europeans said, this is not going to work for Greece, so we better adopt a different approach. The IMF can do what they like, but we're going to bring our interest rate right down to our cost of funds, plus a little bit. And the Irish said, yeah, and no. Yeah, okay, you can have that too. And Portugal. So the interest rate. So that was a bad mistake in the design program. And the IMF knew it too. And in published documents, publicly available documents, said they had a rule that they had developed for Greece, which said they can only make these big loans if there is confidence, high confidence that the government and country can repay. I won't get the wording right, and if there's somebody from IMF here who says, oh, it's a high, it's appreciable, or something like that, but they said that they had to apply an exception for Ireland, that they could not say with confidence that this would work. They knew it wasn't going to work, but it was kind of damaging. I mean, if they'd said, okay, this is not going to be a silly idea, we're going to have new pricing, and the pricing should have been like it was 7 months later. There was another mistake that they made, which was a lot of the borrowing was to go, if you like, I mean, money is fungible, but a lot of the borrowing was to go to build up the capital of the banks. Already that was going on, they said, you've got to do a big, in-depth study, more than you've done now, to try and find out how much the banks are really going to need and put in as much money. Now that was a good idea, but put in the money from where? They said, well, we'll lend the government the money. But then the government is putting the money into the banks, and there's still a certain amount of risk, because you still don't know where the bank's going to end up, because it's very, very difficult to calculate how much. So there was a high risk, and the market said, well, I don't know about this. The governments may put the money into the banks, and they may not get anything out. So what should they have done? The European funds should have said, okay, we have this money, but I tell you what we'll do. We'll put the money into the banks. And if everything goes well, we'll get our money back. And if everything doesn't go well, but at least we haven't imposed this on the state, and the state is able to recover. They didn't do that. If they'd done that, they would have made a lot more money than they did with what they did. But by those mistakes, and there's another one here, but I don't have time, they delayed the recovery. The market is still doubtful, uncertain, and the chart that I had a little while ago showing you the spikes in Irish government borrowing. It peaked actually in middle of 2011. There's uncertainty about what's happening in the euro area, but also uncertainty about Ireland. So it took that long. It took, things had to get worse before they got better. Now, I'm already taking a lot of time. Yes, I have. So I'm going to zoom to my mistakes. Oh. And skip over these other nice charts. Oh, I didn't say anything about the NEC, but they're part of one of the mistakes. Yeah, I think that's one of the mistakes I've chosen to cover. Yeah, all right. So there's my five. I thought there were only four. I have five mistakes. Could the boom have been prevented? I've talked a lot about that. I'm not going to... I'd like to say, well, I'll go through them. The boom could have been prevented, but it required action from different people. The first line, for me, yeah, bankers, the directors of banks. They're the people. You put your money on deposit in the bank, and the assumption is that it's absolutely safe. So for me, the bankers, and people say, oh, the developers. No, for me, the bankers, they're the people who had taken on the responsibility, and they were making money out of doing that business, but they're not doing it safely. The supervisors, yeah, that's the first line of defense then, if the bankers are not doing their job. So there was a failures there, quite clearly, as I said. The government, yes, the government actually encouraged the boom with incentives and for property development. And I put developers at the last of the people, yes. If the developers hadn't chosen, but I think developers are sort of like mechanical mice. They're looking, if you give them money, they will invest in the property. I would like to invest in property. Give me money? Yes. That's what they do. But so don't give them money unless you think they're going to get it back. And I've said those other things about that. So yes, that's definitely a mistake. It's not that much different. It's not that much different from mistakes that were made in other countries, but on the scale was bigger in Ireland because common sense prevailed or would have prevailed in other countries. You say, okay, well, this is a happy time for lending and the property is going fine, but wait a minute, did you see how much they're lending in Ireland? Common sense would have told you, well, we don't know the details, but this is going too far. So, and there were some small steps taken on the supervisory side to slow things down, but in another country, it would have been slowed before it had got that far. And that's why the losses relative to the size of the economy are much higher in Ireland than in most other countries. We can talk about Iceland later, but it's bigger in Iceland. Was the government guarantee a mistake? And I've talked mostly about that, but maybe people want to come back on that. Should the guarantee ever been repudiated? I'm thinking of September, at that point where things are getting two months before the bailout, and there was a lot of debt falling due in the banks at the end of September. Could the government have said, well, we looked at this thing, but it's really too much. We can't, be realistic, we can't pay this. Now, this would definitely have been seen as a default. It couldn't have been challenged in foreign court because it was Irish law. The Irish government had changed the law to say that government borrowings are guaranteed. And so they could change the law back to say, no, they're no longer guaranteed. They could have said that, but it would have been seen as a default, and it would have been marked by the credit rating agency and everything as a default. Very risky in such a globalized economy. People might have been saying, well, we're actually proposing to build a new pharmaceutical plant, but I just see Ireland has defaulted. What are we safe? I mean, what happens if, maybe the people who are building our pharmaceuticals factory could be put in handcuffs and sent on a plane to Korea? No, it's risky behaving in the globalized economy. It wasn't seriously considered, but it was considered by a few people. But it's not as if the government said, we want advice on whether we should repudiate. They never thought of repudiating it. They thought, we said that we'd pay this money and we're going to pay it. But restructuring of bank debt that had, after the guarantee, there was still debt now that the banks had which wasn't guaranteed. Could that have been not paid? Well, then we thought, yeah, maybe so. And there's a lot of interesting wrinkles about that, spreading over several months from November of 2010 until the summer of 2011, including a moment where the government said we're in a draft speech. The minister said that he was looking at the possibility of not paying the unguaranteed debt of the main banks. No, he said of the two failing banks, Anglo-Irish Bank and INBS. And there were some officials at the IMF thought this would be a very good idea. There were some officials in Dublin who thought it would be a very good idea. but this was vetoed, and you say, oh, how can you have vetoed? It's vetoed because the ECB have tools that could do an awful lot of damage to you. If they say, no, you don't do this thing, you're going to suffer a lot more. So you couldn't persuade the ECB. The ECB felt bad about this afterwards. Lots and lots of economists and bankers told them, why did you do that to Ireland? And I remember saying at a meeting in Frankfurt, I said, well, I understand why you wouldn't like, perhaps a spillover effect on confidence in the other banks in Europe. And they say, no, it's only for you. We're only worried about the confidence in your banks. But no, they were worried about the spillover. Michael Noonan, who was the Minister for Finance, says that the president of the ECB told him, if you do this, a bomb will go off in Dublin. The president of the ECB says he can't remember saying that. But I think the bomb is very suggestive. Okay, so that is an interesting question. Should the guarantee have been repudiated? Not in September 2009, but I think there could have been. Not much was to be gained. There wasn't that much that was unguaranteed that could have been. And in fact, if you had done the restructuring in the way that the text would recommend, you would give the bondholders warrants for or shares or something like that. They might actually have done well out of it better than the bonds. So, and actually, the ECB people felt so bad about this afterwards that they allowed some of the financial arrangements around emergency liquidity to the Irish banks to continue in effect, and be taken over by a slightly different mechanism for a long period of time, which saved an enormous sums of money. In fact, saved a lot more than would have been saved by was the fiscal adjustment? No. Could the financing of the bailout have been better engineered? I already told you that. And was the fiscal adjustment too severe? That's out of our theme because we're talking about banks here, but it's an interesting question. Russell, I've gone on too long, as usual.
Yep, you're safely up. Yep, please.
Okay.
Well, there's so much in there. This last bit on the ECB was particularly interesting, obviously. So the guarantee, the interesting thing about the guarantee is it includes all the paper issued by the Irish banks. Do you know what percentage of that paper was owned by non-Irish institutions? So I think it was a very high proportion of it was owned by...
Yeah, and a high proportion. I mean, as you can see, they had been borrowing a lot from abroad, but not all of it. So, and that's one of the problems So how did Iceland do for this situation? Sure. Iceland managed to separate their domestic banking affairs from the rest of it. They said, okay, we're closing all our banks, but as far as you Icelanders who have accounts with the local branches, we're going to set up a new bank for you and it will be transferred.
But did the government ever think, well, look, these foreigners, contractually it's very clear. If the foreigners took the risk, the foreigners made a mistake, the foreigners lost money, the foreigners take the loss. Why wasn't that in the equation?
It's not a moral question. It's a question of word I'm looking for. Is this going to benefit? Is this going to benefit Ireland? That's what they're not. They're not saying the poor foreigners. You know, they won't be able to go on their holidays anymore because they're not going to get the revenue from the Irish investments. That's not what we're thinking. At the time of the guarantee, the advice from the people who were there was, the people, entities, investment funds, the banks that have invested in Irish government, in Irish banks, have also invested in Irish government. So these are the people that we will be going to borrow on the Irish government's account, and they will say, you didn't pay us for the banks. We're not going to lend you any more money. And actually, I was at a meeting recently. When people are talking about well, to cut a long story short, a senior Chinese official said somebody said, well, what about you providing more money into, if we're talking about Ireland, if we're talking about Europe, we suffered in the financial crisis from losses that were made there, and we don't forget these things. And I think that's, it's something really worth remembering, particularly on official relationships. The memories are very long. The financial markets have short memories, relatively short memories. Why? Because people move on. And firms fail, other firms come up. But institutions have long memories.
Yeah, so Ireland wasn't the only country in trouble. The three that spring into my mind are Iceland, Cyprus and Greece, because they all used capital controls as part of the remedy. And Ireland got through without capital controls. We have a book in here by Panikos Dimitriadis, who was running the Central Bank of Cyprus. He also, I should say, was appointed in 2009. He says was
no, he was appointed in 2013.
Okay, well, his point is that the European Commission asked for capital controls, not the government of Cyprus. Capital controls, is that ever considered as part of the solution for Ireland, as it was elsewhere in the Eurozone?
So in Iceland, they introduced capital controls at the behest of, well, some people think they dreamt it up themselves, but the reality is it was the IMF said, you need to introduce capital controls. Okay. I think the capital controls in Cyprus were actually not a particularly good idea. And one reason is that with capital controls, there are always exceptions. Nobody can take any money out. Well, except... And who decides the exception?
My cousin.
Well, I didn't say that. But, so a whole panoply of, exceptions and unfairnesses and preferences gets to be built in, and at the end of the day, the capital controls in Iceland were very specific, very, very complicated situation there. The capital controls were released fairly quickly, except for ones that were related to big players who had.
So for Ireland, it was never in the toolbox. That was never something.
No, no.
Okay.
Not an interesting one to do, no.
Okay. We have a quote here from James Joyce, mistakes are the portals of discovery. So next time we have one of these things happening, what did you learn? Obviously we shouldn't get there in the first place, but assuming we are there, what did you learn about resolution that you can pass on to the central bank governors watching this live?
One thing I noticed is very interesting is that people, foreign partners are very helpful, except when it comes to money. I'm sure he won't mind me recalling episode, the former governor of the Bank of England, Mervyn King, in the middle of all this, he gave me a call. Governor of the Bank of England is on the line. Oh, okay. Hello, Mervyn. Oh, Patrick. Can we do anything to help? That was his very words. And what I was going to say, but didn't, was, we could use a bit of money. And I think we got everything under control, or something like that.
Yeah, so I remember the guarantee very well. I'm sitting in my office, the phone rings, and people phone me up and saying, we're putting all our money in deposit in the Irish banks because they've been guaranteed. And I said, well, have you looked at whether the government can actually back it? They said, yeah, I think government debt to GDP is only 30%, 33%. Yeah. Of course they can back it. So have you looked at the liabilities of the Irish banks? Well, we haven't done that bit yet. Well, I think you should look at that bit. Is one of the lessons from Ireland, given that it goes into this, but an exceptionally, 30% of GDP, as you said, is exceptionally low. Surely one of the morals is that all the newspaper commentary is all focused today on government debt to GDP. Surely the lesson is you've got to look at entire debt to GDP in a scenario like this. Because according to this, Ireland's balance sheet, public balance sheet, was in wonderful condition.
One of the things I think is an important lesson from this is you have to set up your banking and your overall financial system in such a way that the private indebtedness does not just slip over to be in public indebtedness, which is what happened. And some of that has been done. And all of the European countries, including Britain, and Britain was a leader in this, have very tight resolution legislation. So if you're lending money to a bank these days, you're taking their bonds or that, you will look at the small print because there will be a priority of, it's only the retail customers, if you like, and the small businesses, which will be in the top priority, and the government will just not put its hand in its pocket for the other ones. That's the theory, and that's what the law says. But then when you come to the recent failures in Switzerland, they shied away from that. And the same in the United States. They also have resolution legislation, very complex, quite similar to them. And when it came to Silicon Valley Bank in early 23, the way they have the Federal Deposit Insurance Company, that's the organization that looks after these things. They said, okay, we have intervened in SVB Bank, we're taking over, and the depositors will be all right, but in accordance with our law, the bondholders, well, we'll tell them next week whether it will be an interim payment, and they'll have to wait for the bankruptcy. That was Friday. On Sunday, the Secretary of the Treasury and the Chairman of the Federal Reserve said, actually, no, government's guaranteeing everything. So there is governments can be taken for rides by the creditors of banks, and possibly also of cryptocurrencies in the future, which is probably the next big horizon now that banks are being so heavily regulated.
If we open that can of worms, we'll be here till midnight, I think. I have one final question before we open it, and it's a hypothetical, which is why I leave it to the end. So let's say you've been appointed central bank governor in 2007. Obviously, you've no control over nominal interest rates. That's all happening in Frankfurt. What would you have done? Was it really up to bank regulation? Is this a role where you don't have the ability to control interest rates, where you really should be aggressive on regulating the banks? Or what do you think could have been?
I think the tools that you have there are capital requirements. They did increase capital requirements, but so small. I mean, it was just it was not even noticed by the banks because they already had more capital than was required, and this little increase put much more aggressive capital requirements, and that is sort of now semi-automated. But also another thing that's done nowadays, which we only began to do in the working out of this crisis, was granular assessment of the recoverability of loans and the quality of the loans. So that going through loan by loan, seeing what's the maturity, what do we know about the borrower, and that's sort of a stress test. What would you have done
if you'd seen a bank with, you thought, an obvious deterioration in credit quality? What do you think should have been done about it?
You have to increase the capital. If they can't increase the capital, and you think you can intervene them, you can put them through resolution. You separate out vital public, there may be no vital public services that they're providing. For example, Anglo-Irish Bank wasn't really providing public services that couldn't have been provided by anybody else. You would have just taken Anglo-Irish Bank, you'd say, this bank has failed, we're putting it into a resolution, and the insured deposits will be paid out of the deposit insurance fund, and the other deposits which are not insured.
In the boom, there was a way of being proactive on credit quality in banks and intervening.
You could have done these things, and you could have had the proper legislation to do it. Okay. One little thing that they could have done, the banks paid between the first of the emerging parts of the crisis in the middle of 2007, between that and the day of the guarantee, the Irish banks paid very substantial dividends to their customers. Not anything more than usual, sure, but very substantial dividends. I can't remember, it's like 1 point something billion. They could have been told, situation has become highly risky, stop paying dividends. Now, somebody will say, oh yeah, but that will frighten the horses, and it might have brought on the... Sometimes it's better to bring the crisis up, because then you can deal with it. If people don't realize the situation is dangerous, then they'll continue behaving in a dangerous manner.
I could go on all night, but I'm not allowed to. So questions from the floor? David has the microphone. Just put your hand up. It looks like the pubs are open.
It's working. Yeah, it's working.
Hi. Are we currently heading for another crash?
We're heading for another crash. Not in Ireland, he said comfortably. So a few things are, if there is another crash, where will it be coming from? And one thing is, obviously, the AI bubble, which is creating very, very high equity market valuations. And you say, well, I don't care about equity because they can go up and go down. But they have an effect on what's happening what's being bought using these valuations and raising capital. So if the AI turns out to be, supposing it turns out that inside ChatGPT and all the other AIs, it's just like the little man in the yellow brick road of Wizard of Oz, that it's, there isn't anything there. Well, it won't become evident overnight, but it might become over a period of time. Actually, this AI isn't as good as we thought it is. General intelligence is not 5 or 10 years away, it's 50 or 100 years away. We could imagine things like that, and that could be a substantial fall. Cryptocurrencies could be substantial, because we know that there's nothing behind them, but especially it's quite a risk that if cryptocurrencies become seen as something which the Federal Reserve has to bail out because of damaging side effects, you could see a very big impact on the US financial system. So these are the sort of directions where there could be crises. We're certainly at this stage of the cycle where people are not saying, well, there are no crises in the offing because we're at the bottom now. We're not at the bottom.
Got a question to front?
So, would you add private debt to that? I mean, it looks from the outside that the valuations are at historic highs, the collateral's at historic lows, and the magnitude of the market's way ahead of where it's been historically.
Yeah, and we see the techniques that have been used, that were used before the bubble being. Also, one thing that I spot in the newspaper coverage is which seems very dubious to me, is the way private funds selling their assets to each other at negotiated prices in ways that, if the valuations, true valuations, would be much lower, they will not become evident in that way, put it like that. So that's another area. But these are areas of concern. It's not as if, you've heard all these before, and people are looking at them. And if cryptocurrencies is the one that there isn't a framework of supervision. It's being built now for stable coins, but not for the other stuff. So in private credit, there's no framework for that either. So, but people know about these things. It's a bit like the pension funds around the time of the Liz Truss budget. People knew about this as a vulnerability, but nobody was really in charge of preventing it from being there. So.
We got time for one last question from the floor.
Thank you. Do you think the ratings by the credit agencies were broadly fair? Do you think that they are too favourable in other markets, such as the US? Do you think there's a potential conflict of interest anywhere along the line? Do you think there's room or need for any alternative credit ratings agencies?
So I don't have. I know several people who work in credit ratings. They seem to be clever people, but I think that it's peculiar the way in which they have been given so much power, particularly as it relates to sovereigns, and particularly as it relates to European sovereigns. They affect the degree to which the European Central Bank will lend to a sovereign country. Why? Because some American firm is providing a rating. I think the chart that I showed you isn't the worst chart that you could show to the inadequacies of pricing. I don't I actually think, I'm not an expert on credit rating agencies. It seems to me that they, broadly speaking, do a reasonable job for smaller firms. That you really say, well, before I go ahead with this thing, what's the credit rating? I say, oh yeah, they're all right. But for sovereigns, I don't think they can add value.
I'm going to finish with a question, which is on sovereigns, actually. France, having lived through the Irish, 70% of French bank debt is owned by foreigners. 53% of the government bond market is owned by foreigners. 60% of all paper issued by corporate non-financials is issued by foreigners. There's a problem in the government debt market. And what happens next, Patrick?
France is not Iceland, and Iceland paid all their debt. So I don't see France as being a very significant. If I was a vulture fund, I wouldn't be waiting around for French debt.
So you're a buyer.
I won't go so far as to say I'm a buyer. Give me some money. And
Okay. Patrick, as you can tell, Patrick is raising a fund, and if you'd like to speak to him at the end, please come and do so. So we have some tickets left for our events this week. If you'd like to sign up, we've got a few more things coming up. If you could do me the favour of just taking your glasses and empty tins to the back of the room when you finish, but most importantly, can you please join me in thanking Patrick Honohan.
Yeah, no, you deserve that.